Good afternoon and welcome to the Public Interest Law Section's presentation of new trends in affordable housing. My name is Laura Beckman. I'm with the Florida Bar's Public Interest Law Section, and we're very grateful to the Legal Services of North Florida for hosting this webinar today. We are very excited to have with us as our speaker on new trends in affordable housing is Shar Amami. Shar is the founder and director of the Florida Community Development Legal Project. She's also the director of the Affordable Housing and Community Development Practice Group at Legal Services of Greater Miami. Shar's practice focuses on representation of nonprofit developers and other organizations that are developing or preserving affordable housing in community-based facilities. Her representation includes providing counsel on nonprofit corporate governance and business development, drafting and negotiating business agreements including joint ventures, the formation and structuring of business entities, and transactional legal drafting and document review pertaining to the affordable housing real estate development process from site acquisition through closing. Shar attended Vanderbilt University and graduated magna cum laude for her undergraduate degree and attended the University of Miami Law School where she received her JD and an LLM in real property development. Shar, thank you so much for participating today. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. There is a button on your webinar platform for you to be able to post questions, and I'll be monitoring the questions throughout, and we'll save those and ask those at the end of Shar. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Shar. Shar, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you all so much for having me. So I thought, you know, when I was thinking about putting this together, I thought we could do a focus on some new trends in affordable housing, but we really can't talk about trends in affordable housing until I give you a little primer or overview of what affordable housing is and the law behind it, and some important concepts and definitions so that you'll be able to follow along easier during the presentation. And then at the end, we'll talk about some of the new trends in affordable housing. Let's start. I'm just trying to advance the slide here. Okay. So I think for anyone that is interested in affordable housing law, it would be great to look at the ABA Forum on Affordable Housing Law and Community Development. This is a subset of the Real Estate Practice Division with the ABA, and they publish journals about 3 to 4 times per year on various affordable housing and community development matters. They have a great conference every year in Washington, D.C., where most, if not all, of the affordable housing attorneys and advocates and bureaucrats from HUD and other places around the country attend that conference. It's usually in May. So if you're interested, it's a great group to join. And also the other group that I follow is the National Housing Law Project. And I have their website there. You can subscribe to their listserv, and they come out with updates on topics related to affordable housing at least several times a month. So those are 2 great resources for those that are interested in this area of the law. So why do we focus on affordable housing, or why should there even be a focus on affordable housing? These are just some statistics for you to think about. Since the mid-1960s, about 10 to 15% of our US population has lived below the poverty line. In 2019, for a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, the poverty line is $25,465 a year. The level of poverty in the United States, according to last year's census data, was 11.8%. That's about 1 in 8 Americans that lives below the poverty level. The poverty rate for Blacks is almost 21%, compared to 8% for non-Hispanic whites, so that's quite a disparity there. And we all know that if you're living in poverty, you can't obtain food, shelter, healthcare, or transportation. And one of the most basic financial obligations is housing. And poverty affects greatly a person's ability to have safe and decent housing. I think one of the reasons why I became so passionate about affordable housing is that I really believe it's the cornerstone to everything that we work on in the poverty law arena and as a public interest attorney. If our clients do not have access to safe, decent, affordable housing, the other aspects of their life are greatly impacted. So if they're not living in housing, it's difficult for them to hold down a job. If they're not living in safe, decent housing, their health greatly suffers, theirs and their family members. If they're not living in stable, decent, affordable housing, it's very difficult for them to afford transportation or get access to food. So it's really sort of the cornerstone, I think, of everything that we do in poverty law. So making sure that we have enough safe, decent, affordable housing is extremely important. So just looking at some housing cost statistics, these are pretty harrowing. 37% of the average American budget is spent on housing costs. And the poorer you are in America, the more you spend on housing. So for example, if you make less than $1,000 a year, the average that you spend on housing is 50 to 80% of your income each year. Now in large metropolitan areas like Miami-Dade County where I practice, it's estimated that 80 to 100% of households are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. And of course, if you're a renter, you are more than twice as likely as an owner to pay more than half of your income for housing, especially in cities like Miami, where my practice is primarily located. And then of course we have rent subsidies that are available, but they currently only reach about 1 in 4 eligible homes. So we don't have enough. There are very long waiting lists for those rent subsidies, such as Section 8. And so we really need more affordable housing across the board. When we talk about affordable housing, in general, we're talking about 3 different sectors: the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, and the government sector. And you can't have a discussion about affordable housing unless you understand how 3 of those sectors work together. So the clients that I represent are nonprofit corporations that are primarily engaged in affordable housing preservation and production. And these clients are 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. They generally combine the business savvy of for-profit entities with a service focus of a government-type run program in their approach to affordable housing. So while the for-profit affordable housing developers are choosing projects by cost versus profit, the nonprofit developers may go ahead and participate in certain projects or develop certain projects, even though the cost benefit is not as great as maybe another deal. It's also interesting to note that most of the nonprofit corporations that engage in affordable housing development are working on smaller affordable housing projects as well, which we greatly need. We have so many buildings in large metropolitan areas like Miami-Dade County that are in disrepair, 10, 20, 30 unit apartment buildings. And those buildings are generally not eligible for low-income housing tax credits, which is an affordable housing program that we'll talk about in a little bit. And so if those buildings are not eligible for those tax credits, you have to be sort of creative in putting together other types of affordable housing financing in order to get them rehabbed and funded and occupied. And normally the nonprofits are interested in working on those more difficult, smaller projects where they're serving people at or below 50% of area median income. And then, of course, we have the government sector, which is going to provide some of the affordable housing funding. They are seeking to alleviate burdens of government, highly regulated, very bureaucratic. We know that policies change with administration and lobbying power. So those are really the 3 sectors that we talk about when we talk about affordable housing development. Some initial key terms so that you understand the rest of the presentation today. What is affordable housing? Well, the general definition, and this is a very general definition, but it's housing deemed affordable to those with a median household income as rated by a certain index Here, we do area median income based on metropolitan areas. And the generally accepted definition of affordability in the United States is that a household should not be paying more than 30% of its annual income on housing. If you look at the HUD definition of affordable housing, it's a bit more narrow. HUD is defining affordable housing, of course, in accordance with area median income, but they want affordable housing that is funded with federal dollars to have a recorded regulatory agreement in effect for at least 15 years. And the projects have to meet at least the minimum low-income housing tax credit restriction of 20% of units at 50% of area median income, or 40% with economic rents, which means a portion paid by the tenants on those units which are no greater than the low-income housing tax credit rents. And the third part of the definition, which would also classify as affordable housing, are mixed income projects if the minimum low-income unit rent and occupancy restrictions and regulatory agreements meet the above criteria. So basically, HUD is just saying that there has to be a recorded rent regulatory agreement in effect for at least 15 years. You have to meet the basic restrictions, threshold restrictions of the 2050 test or the 4060 test. So 20% of units at 50 of AMI or 40 at 60% of AMI. And then you are able to classify a project as affordable housing if it's mixed income, but it has to comply with the above two parameters, A and B. So I always get the question, of course, we talk about area median income or AMI in affordable housing all of the time. We throw that term around constantly. So what is area median income? Well, in the US, households are commonly defined in terms of the amount of realized income they earn relative to the area median income. And localized AMI figures are calculated annually, and it's based on a survey of comparably sized households within geographic ranges known as metropolitan statistic areas. Those metropolitan statistic areas are defined by the US Office of Management and Budget. And in general, there are different classes of area median income. So when you're talking about very low income households, those are earning no more than 50% of AMI. So 50% or less of area median income is low income. Extremely low income or ELI households are those at or below 30 of AMI. And then you have low income, which is between 50 and 80, and moderate, which is between 80 and 120. And then a term that you've probably heard thrown around in the past several years is workforce housing. And in general, the definition of workforce housing varies based on the metropolitan area. But for example, in Miami-Dade County, the county's definition of workforce housing is all housing which is housing those at or between 80 and 140% of area median income. Okay, some other key terms. In affordable housing, we talk a lot about community economic development. In general, what community economic development means is we are trying to make low-income communities more resource-rich. And in general, that usually means from the creation of or preservation of affordable housing, focusing on housing that's close to transportation centers, making sure that these communities have access to healthcare, education, and food supplies. So that's what we're really working on when we talk about community economic development. The organizations that I primarily represent and that my group at Legal Services of Miami primarily represents are community development corporations. This is not a legal term. It just means that it's an entity that's a nonprofit entity that's engaged in affordable housing development and or preservation. And so we generally call them community development corporations, but it's not like you get registered as a CDC. You're simply a Florida nonprofit corporation. You generally have tax-exempt 501c3 status, and your focus is affordable housing. LIHTC, when people say the LIHTC program, they're talking about the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. This is the largest affordable housing program in the United States. It is a program that is actually part of the Internal Revenue Code. It provides tax credits for investors that are wanting to invest in affordable housing developments. We'll talk more about that in a second. CDFIs are Community Development Financial Institutions. These are nonprofit banking institutions that have 501c3 status that invest, lend, and provide banking services in support of community economic development enterprises. So CDFIs are looking at investing in job creation and small businesses and affordable housing development, and generally they're funding community development corporations that are doing this work. CBAs are community benefit agreements. CBAs have come into vogue in the last, I would say, 10 years. They are agreements between developers of affordable and non-affordable housing and a coalition or local community group. And we'll talk a little bit more about CBAs also later on in the presentation. So when we talk about legal advocacy in community economic development work, we're primarily talking about lawyers that are helping clients with affordable housing. They're helping nonprofits and tenants and clients with anti-displacement. Generally, you are trying to talk about policies and other things that would promote sustainable, smart, affordable housing development, such as inclusionary zoning. You want your work to be environmentally sound, and you want these projects to be environmentally friendly and green. That's the goal. And you're advocating for living wages, good jobs, and sometimes the vehicle for achieving all of those things, especially if you're negotiating with a for-profit developer of market rate housing, is a community benefit agreement. Okay, so let's talk just briefly about the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. This is the largest affordable housing program in the United States. It was enacted in 1986 as part of the Tax Reform Act. It is found in Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code. It provides tax incentives to the private sector to invest in affordable housing. So investors actually get a dollar-for-dollar tax reduction on their federal tax liability every year if they invest in a LIHTC project. So it's not a tax deduction, it's an actual dollar-for-dollar tax reduction. So let's say JP Morgan Chase owes the federal government $10 million in taxes. If they had contributed $10 million in an investment in a low-income housing tax credit project that year, they would owe zero taxes because it's a dollar-for-dollar reduction on their federal tax liability. So it's very, very lucrative for large businesses and corporations that have large tax liabilities. The credit is based on the cost of construction or rehab of a project. And when I did this slide, the program was 31 years old. The program is older now, of course, and it is the oldest and longest living supply side affordable housing program in the US. And as of today's date, almost 2.8 or 2.9 million units of affordable housing have been built under this program. So it's really wildly successful. So when we talk about the LIHTC program, we're getting equity from investors. So the housing tax credits are given to housing credit authorities. which are units of, they're quasi-governmental units of the state government. Each state has a housing credit authority that runs the tax credit program for each state. The federal government allocates tax credits per state, and then those housing tax credits are awarded to projects in each state. When the tax credits are awarded to a project, they are then sold to investors who use the tax credit to reduce their tax liability dollar for dollar. So this infuses cash into the project, reduces the need for a large mortgage, and is used to pay a large portion of the total development cost of the deal. The program is regulated by the IRS, and it is administered by a state housing credit agency. There's two types of tax credits, the 9% credit and the 4% credit. The 9% credit is also known as the 70% present value credit. It generally means that about 70% of your total development cost will be covered by the credit. And in Florida, these credits are awarded annually on a competitive basis. The 4% credit is also known as the 30% present value credit. What that means is about 30% of your total development costs will be funded through the equity investment from sale of the credit. And the 4% credit is available with tax-exempt bonds through the state's volume cap allocation. So if your project is more than 50% funded with tax-exempt bonds, you can get an automatic allocation of a 4% credit from the state housing credit agency. And that's true for every state housing credit agency in the United States, not just for Florida. So the next slide is simply an example of how these credits are calculated. We're going to go through a calculation of a 9% housing credit. The 9% credit is competitive, and each state has a different procedure for awarding the allocation. Florida is a lottery system. Basically in Florida, the way it works is that applicants submit their 9% credit applications, and in general, if the applicants know what they're doing, they will all score a 100% on the application. Because everyone scores 100% on the application because they've checked all the boxes, what Florida does is they just put everything into a pool, and they select the applications based on a lottery system. So the 9% credit is designed to fund 70% of what we call eligible development costs. So here's an example. Let's say your land acquisition is $2 million and your cost of construction is $3 million. Maybe you have some site improvements of $500,000 and what we call eligible soft costs of $100,000. When you add all of those things up, you have what we call total development cost, or TDC, of $5.6 million. So what's the amount of equity that can be raised from a sale of credits? You have to figure out what your eligible basis is first. Your total development cost will not be your eligible basis. There are lots of things that are excluded from basis, like the cost of land cannot be included in eligible basis. Interest on permanent loans also cannot be included. Insurance and property taxes incurred following completion, also not included in eligible basis. Basically, what's included in eligible basis has to be a depreciable cost. So if you take the 5.6 total development cost and you subtract the land acquisition, you're left with an eligible basis of 3.6 million. Now you have to figure out what your qualified basis is. Qualified basis is based on the amount of units in the property that are going to be affordable. So in this example, I've assumed that 100% of the units are going to be affordable. So that gives you a qualified basis of 3.6 million times 100%, which is 3.6 million. So that's your qualified basis. So how do you calculate the annual credit to the investor? You take your 3.6 million, you multiply it by a 9% credit rate. The credit rate is going to change. The Department of Treasury is going to publish it every month. It's based on the applicable federal rate. So it's not going to actually be exactly 9%. It's going to deviate slightly based on the applicable federal rate. I've used 9% just in terms of ease for this example. So you take 3.6 million times 9%. That gives you $324,000 per year. That's the credit that they will take every year. The investor takes the credit over a 10-year period. So that's 3.24 million in total credits. Now, investors purchase these credits on the open market. Some investors will pay $1 per credit if the project is in a good area, if they think that their returns are going to be higher than maybe another project. And so they'll pay $1 for each credit. So let's say in this instance that maybe they're not going to pay 1 for the credit. Maybe they pay 75 cents on the dollar. That actually would only give you 2.43 million in equity. So as you can see, if you have total development costs of 5.6 million, in this example, a sale of the 9% credits would give you 2.43 million towards your total development costs. The rest of the amount you have to try and make up using other forms of financing, and we call that subordinate debt. And sometimes it's soft debt, like loans from local government, affordable housing loans, low interest loans. We have a program here in Miami-Dade County called the Surtax program. They provide gap financing for these deals. You can get home funds invested into these deals, community development block grants invested in these deals. The Federal Home Loan Bank has a program called the AHP program. Those dollars can be used as gap financing in these transactions as well. So you have, as a developer, the idea is you have to figure out, even if you get the equity investment, how do you make up the rest of the development cost? And of course, because these projects are affordable housing projects, they can't support a large or high debt service. So the more money you can get in free or forgivable loans, the better. Sometimes there's what we call a basis booster if these projects are in either a qualified census tract or a difficult to develop area. So that's what a DDA and a QCT is. And that will give these projects a basis booster of 30% of the qualified basis. If you get a basis booster, now you can calculate the sale of the credits off of a higher amount, which gives you more equity. So that's why projects that are in these areas, if you can get a project and qualify to be in one of these areas, it makes the project in terms of finding investment. Okay, so in the low-income housing tax credit program, there are certain things that as a developer you have to comply with. You either have to make 40% of your units at 60 of AMI or 20% of the units at 50 of AMI. Now, there are new income averaging guidelines that just came out in March of 2018. These income averaging guidelines allow owners to elect to serve households with incomes of up to 80% of AMI, so long as the average income in the project remains at 60% of AMI. So this is a big change to the low-income housing tax credit program. It used to be that all of the units had to be affordable to those at or below 60% of area median income. Now the units can be affordable to those at or below 80% of AMI, so long as the average of the entire project is 60 of AMI. Now here in Florida, you have to keep your project affordable for at least 30 years beyond the initial well, it's 50 years total in Florida. So according to the IRS guidelines, it has to be affordable for at least 30. In Florida, though, you have to keep the project affordable for not only the compliance period time that is mandated by the IRS, but an additional amount of time because Florida records what we call an extended use agreement and a land use regulatory agreement that makes low-income housing tax credit projects affordable for a total of 50 years. So this differs state by state. but here in Florida, the affordability period is 50 years. So who can live in a tax credit community? Well, we already discussed this. Individuals at or below 80% of area median income. And you can be a Section 8 voucher holder and live in a low-income housing tax credit property. Oops. Okay. Every state must publish what we call a qualified allocation plan. A qualified allocation plan governs each state's tax credit program. And they do this every year. And the QAP will outline the policy objectives of that year's program and the application process. There are 3 elements to every qualified allocation plan: the set-asides, the threshold requirements, and preferences. And you, the public, can comment on these qualified allocation plans. So as I was saying earlier, each of the 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, has a housing credit authority that governs the low-income housing tax credit program for that state, and they must create a qualified allocation plan that is used to evaluate the tax credit application. Interestingly, only 1 out of 5 applications nationwide receives the 9% credit. It's actually even more competitive here in Florida. The 9% credit is extremely competitive, and I would say that if you are a very large low-income housing tax credit developer and you've been doing this for a long time and you know how to do it, and you put in a lot of applications every year, you may get 1 9% deal awarded per year, or maybe 1 every other year. And for most developers, it's less. At least 10% of your project costs have to be incurred no later than 6 months after the date the tax credit allocation is made, or by the close of the year in which the allocation is made. So there are time limits on getting these projects ready. As I said before, Florida Housing Finance Corporation, which is our housing credit agency, they require a land use regulatory agreement for 15 extra years from the in-service date, then an extended use agreement for an additional 35 years for a total of 50 years of affordability. The actual IRS mandated tax credit compliance period is 15 years only, and investors will take the credit over a 10 to 11 year period. After the initial credit compliance period of 15 years, most investors will typically exit these deals. They're really only a part of these deals for the tax benefits that they receive from the deal. Once those tax benefits have been exhausted, they will generally exit the deals and either sell their interest to an outside party or another party that's a part of the deal, or there may be a mechanism in place for them to transfer their interest to the nonprofit partner in the deal for what we call debt plus exit taxes. It's a provision in Section 42 of the code that allows transfer of the property to a qualified nonprofit for a low price after the initial credit compliance period. So how these deals are legally structured is generally the following. Usually the projects are owned in a limited liability limited partnership or a limited liability company. There is a general partner or developing member of that LLC that is the developer. And then there is the limited equity investor that serves as the limited liability investor in the deal. If it's an LLC, you generally have the developing member and the investor member, because there are members of limited liability companies. If it's structured as a partnership, you have the general partner and the limited partner. And the investors benefit from these deals, not only from the credit, but from the partnership's pass-through of passive losses associated with the income-producing real estate. And you get, depreciation and interest expense deductions. And the limited partners, which are the investors, they're usually the 99.99% owners of the partnership or in the limited liability company. And that's because they receive 99.9% of the tax credits and the passive losses. So what is the investor role? The investor really has a very limited role. They are providing the equity for the transaction. They make capital contributions based on a pay-in schedule to the owner-developer. They generally have consent rights over major decisions in order to protect their investments. And sometimes they'll also receive an asset management fee as compensation for oversight activities. Sorry, I went one slide too fast. Okay. So that was the overview of the low-income housing tax credit program. It's pretty dense information. That's really just to give you a broad brush overview. And we're going to move now to some of the other trends in affordable housing. I've listed what I thought were really the 6 biggest trends today. Sustainable design, which really means choosing sites in proximity to schools, public transportation, and other needs. Building structures within town centers or cities with existing infrastructure. Designing units and outdoor spaces with passive design strategy in order to reduce energy needs. Utilizing LED and Energy Star checklists to decrease energy consumption. And selecting durable fixtures, equipment, hardware, and finishes that are easy to repair. So this is really all about sustainable design and green housing design as well. So what do we mean when we say green housing design? A green building is really designed, built, operated, and disposed of in a resource-efficient manner. This is really the trend now, not just in affordable housing development, but in housing development in general. General green building benefits include environmental benefits, economic, and social. When we talk about environmental benefits, we're referring to enhancement and protection of biodiversity in our ecosystems, improved air and water quality, reduced waste systems. When we talk about economic benefits, we're really speaking of lower operation costs, enhanced occupier productivity, optimization of the life cycle of the building. And for social benefits, we're talking about improved health and comfort for residents and minimizing the burden on local infrastructure and improved aesthetics. There is a great coalition that specifically they're a nonprofit 501c3 organization that their whole goal is to promote and enhance green affordable housing. And I listed their link there. They're called the Green Affordable Housing Coalition. If you want to read more about the strategies used for green affordable housing, I would go to the site. They have a lot of great information. The other major trend in affordable housing is using alternative building materials. So there are lots of different alternative building materials. We're sort of stuck in the dark ages in this country in many ways with affordable housing production and production of housing in general, because in general we use the CBS method of construction, which is concrete block system. And of course, here in Florida, we have all sorts of requirements because of our risk for hurricanes. However, they have come out with a lot of alternative building materials that are hurricane rated safe, some modular homes or prefab homes, the cost of which is much, much lower to create. As a matter of fact, New York City's Affordable Housing Agency is now requiring modular construction for a mixed-use development. And Seattle is working on spending about $12 million on 3 pilot projects that seek to house the homeless in modular construction. The other alternative building material that they've been using now are steel and building steel frame homes. Shipping container homes is another new alternative building material. There's actually a project that's the first in Palm Beach County that is going to start construction in the middle to end of this year. It's called Arts on Broadway, and it's going to be the first multifamily affordable container housing. And I actually represented the nonprofit. There are 2 nonprofits in that deal, and I represent one of them in working on that. And they have received financing from Opportunity Zone investors on that deal and the city of West Palm Beach. And then the other new development in affordable housing is this whole tiny home concept. So the whole idea is that in affordable housing, the rents that you charge have to be really low. And the only way you can charge really low rents is if your cost of construction is kept down to an amount where you don't have to go out and get a large loan and service a high amount of debt on the property. So you have to acquire your land for little to nothing. You have to be very cognizant of the amount you're spending on the cost of construction. And then you have to make sure that your operational costs moving forward are low enough that the rents that you're bringing in will be able to support that long term. So you're really looking at trying to keep costs down throughout the entire process. And then the green building requirements helps you really keep costs down in the future. So even though it's more expensive up front for some of these green building designs and requirements, in the long term, it's going to save on repair costs and utility costs, especially that you're passing on to your tenants. So those are some of the new trends in the building materials used for affordable housing. Remember that we're always trying to keep the cost down because if it's going to cost too much to build the housing, you're not going to be able to charge low rents. And earlier in the presentation, when I was talking about the financing strategies, all of these affordable housing properties are deeply, deeply subsidized. And we talk about stacking the debt on these properties, the forgivable debt. So you want, equity investment, which is, usually from a low-income housing tax credit investor, and then you're going to want to subsidize the property with other types of low debt or grants or low interest loans from other government sources. So the other thing that's new in affordable housing is accessibility. And when we talk about accessibility, we're actually not talking about what we normally think of, which is, is it accessible to those with disabilities? Is it ADA compliant? We're actually talking about, is the affordable housing project location efficient? And this is a new trend in affordable housing development. We're trying to focus development in compact, multimodal neighborhoods that provide convenient and affordable access to services and activities. This goes along with the whole community economic development focus on affordable housing. So the other new trend is not to evaluate the affordability on 30% of your annual income spent on the housing, but on an ability of the lower income housing, a lower income household to spend less than 40% of their budgets on housing and transportation combined. So we're actually seeing the definition of affordability changing from don't spend more than 30% of your income on housing to what we want to make sure that a lower income household is spending less than 45% of their budgets on housing and transportation combined. And there are lots of reasons for this. The primary reason is that a cheap house is not really affordable if it has high operating or transportation costs. And you could seemingly spend more money on the housing if it's efficient utility-wise and close to transportation hubs. So this is one of the biggest trends in affordable housing development now. And then the last big trend is this focus on community benefits agreements. It's a contract between a developer and community representative, committing the developer to fulfill specific obligations in connection with a particular project. So in order for a developer to get projects approved at local government levels, they usually need the support of the community. And usually the unit of local government will not provide a building permit, they won't ratify the project, they won't provide funding, they won't, approve density bonuses or whatever else that developer wants unless there's community buy-in. So what we're seeing a lot now, and at Legal Services of Miami, our division is representing a lot of different community groups around Miami-Dade County trying to negotiate these CBAs with developers of market rate housing. And some of the elements that we look for from the developer are the following. Can they provide an affordable housing set aside, either on or off site? Can they provide jobs and living wages for laborers in that area? Will they commit to providing permanent jobs? Would they commit to providing a cash developer contribution to support local government programs? Would they include any public space in their development, such as green space or a park, maybe a playground for the community, a community garden? So that's sort of the last biggest trend in affordable housing development that we see quite a bit of now, and is becoming more popular. The last thing that I just want to hit on is there are lots of new things surrounding HUD property preservation strategies, and in particular surrounding the rental assistance demonstration program that HUD came out with a couple of years ago for public housing properties. So it's actually not a couple of years ago now. They launched it in 2012, but it was a way for public housing agencies to generate funds to preserve public housing. It basically allows them to convert their public housing units into project-based Section 8 assisted units. And that allows them to take out financing on the property and allows them to get more affordable housing dollars into the property to do a rehab and to keep the property affordable. The RAD program was originally only intended for public housing developments, but now they have authorized the RAD program for housing for the elderly, which is known as the 202 program. So if you're interested in this, I've listed several links here. There's general information about the RAD program, and then a link on the RAD program for Section 202 housing. What was happening in these housing projects, not just public housing projects, but housing projects built under the 202 program, is that these projects now are aging and they need capital repairs. But as an owner-developer of one of these projects, you are prohibited from putting senior debt on your projects. You can't just go out and get a bank loan and have that bank loan be in first position on one of these 202 projects because it's prohibited by HUD. And of course, as we know, every institutional bank wants to be in first position. So you can't get a first position bank loan. And then on top of that, you cannot use any payments that you receive from the 202 program to pay down other debt on the property. So this leaves developers completely stuck. If you're a developer owner of one of these 202 projects, there's no way for you to refinance your property unless HUD finds a way to convert the property to project-based Section 8 and get rid of your original restrictions. So now they've authorized the RAD program for Section 202 properties. And in the next, Yeah, this is the latest RAD notice on the Section 202 program and the other changes. And what we're hoping is that Congress will also authorize the RAD program for Section 811 properties. Those are properties that were funded for those with disabilities. And that will help both the 202 properties and the 811 properties work on recapitalization and refinancing strategies so that we can preserve those properties into the future. And then the last slide are just some highlights from the new section on converting these 202 properties under the RAD program. And that's all I have. That's all of the, I thought, most pertinent updates on trends in affordable housing.
Great. Thank you so much, Char. We do not have any open questions at this point. We did have one question about asking whether we could send the materials out, a copy of the PowerPoint out after the presentation, and we will certainly do that. We'll email the participants a copy of the presentation. If you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the question box, and we have a few minutes to field those now. John has also put up the CLE credit number, if you want to jot that down so that you can get CLE credit for the webinar. And please also, if you're not already a member of the Public Interest Law section, we would love to have you join. We try to do these webinars once a month. We are always happy to take suggestions for ideas of things people would like to see. But please go ahead and join the Public Interest Law section if you haven't already. We'd love to have you as a member. And again, many thanks to Legal Services of North Florida for hosting this. We have had a couple questions come in, Shar. So can companies get tax rebates for affordable housing and building green housing at the same time? Is this perhaps the reason affordable housing is making that trend?
So when you talk about a tax rebate, I'm not sure exactly what you're talking about. There is a program in the state of Florida. It's a tax credit type of program, and right now the name of it is escaping me, but it's not under the low-income housing tax credit program. It's basically a way for businesses to contribute to affordable housing and get a reduction on their sales tax. And I can get the name of that program for you and email it to Laura, and then she can pass it along. But that's the only other tax rebate program we really have in the state of Florida, other than the low-income housing tax credit program, which of course, if you're a large enough corporation and you need a break on your federal income taxes, that would be the way to go. You would want to invest in one of those low-income housing tax credit projects.
Okay, great, thanks. And then what is the legal and political, I'm sorry, before that, John, could you put the CLE slide up again? I don't think everybody got that. And Shar, what is the legal and political trend towards cooperative housing, resident-owned communities, and other types of housing that are decommodified from the market?
Yeah, so we used to, the federal government sponsored a program. It was through HUD back in the 70s, and it was an interest decoupling or reduction program known as the Section 236 program. And a lot of the housing that was developed out of that program, which gave developers a very low interest rate on developing affordable housing, those housing projects were actually, most of them were organized as co-ops, as tenant-run and owned membership organizations that were cooperative forms of ownership. We only have 2 left in Miami-Dade County, and in the state of Florida, I don't think we have any of those left over. I think the ones in Miami-Dade County are the only 2 that are left. And across the nation, affordable housing co-ops have sort of gone out of vogue. I think that the primary reason for that is that most of those cooperatives were abysmal failures after the initial 10 to 15 years because they were not provided ongoing assistance on how to recapitalize those properties and renovate them. And because most of those properties were tenant run, they were not run very well. And you know, if you have a tenant run co-op, as tenant board members of the co-op, you have to sort of understand that if your expenses are going up, you need to be able to raise the rent. And a lot of those tenant-run co-ops were very against doing that. And so what happened in a lot of those properties, and I represent one here in South Florida, and I have for almost 15 years now. But what happened is the properties they fell into great disrepair, and rents never kept up with even affordable market rents in the area. And so most of those properties were acquired by other entities, by developers, and redeveloped that way. And the HUD mortgages were paid off because it just wasn't a very practical way to run a large affordable housing property.
Great, thanks, Shar. John, can we double check the CLE number? It looks like that CLE number is actually for a different webinar that we did. So when we send out the slides and everything to everyone, we'll send out updated CLE information as well if that's not correct. And it looks like that's all of our questions, and it also looks like we're out of time. So Shar, thank you again. We really appreciate your time. That was a very informative and interesting webinar, and I hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. Hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.